Radio TV phono nut here, and we have something a bit unusual. This is a Philco model 38-34, and what makes this radio a bit unusual is that it operates off of 6 volts DC. These were primarily used on farms and in other places without AC lines. Uses a vibrator power supply to chop up the 6 volts DC and then drive a transformer to step the voltage up to the high voltage needed necessary to run the chassis. And you can see one of the battery clips still remains. That's a pretty good honking size clip there. So yeah, you could connect these to your tractor battery or your car battery and have you a radio, and then when the battery went dead, have it charged and you're ready to go again. The speaker in here looks like a pen drive magnetic type speaker, which is a carryover from 1920s technology. This particular radio uses push-pull audio output stage, but it does not have an audio output transformer, meaning that the speaker voice coil is a high impedance center tapped coil. Now if this voice coil were to be open, we could substitute a regular PM speaker, but we would have to add an audio output transformer. But hopefully it won't come to that. Okay, the chassis looks to have all of its mounting bolts, which is a good sign. I find a lot of times that these battery operated sets haven't been worked on that much because a lot of them were only used for a few years, and then when AC powered radios became available, the old battery set was stored away somewhere and forgotten about for the next 60 years. So let's get the chassis out and see what it looks like. And you can see we have a visitor that showed up last night. He acts like he wants to come say hello, but still a little bit skittish. Have to be careful though, because I got a big dog that would eat him for lunch. Come here, kitty cat. Come on. See there, you touch him and he wants to run away. Come here. Come on. Come on. Alright, here's the speaker. Cone looks to be in decent shape, but of course that's all meaningless if the voice coil is open. So before we do anything else, let's go get the meter and see what kind of shape this coil is in. Now I will tell you, these speakers generally do not sound as good as a regular electrodynamic or a permanent magnet speaker. These are kind of tinny sounding, or at least the ones I've heard were kind of tinny sounding, but you never know, this might fool me. Meow, meow. Alright, let's see if this thing's good. Yep, we have continuity there about. And then let's see from the other side. Yep, the speaker's good. Or at least the coil has continuity. Alright, top of the chassis looks about average, and this power supply unit is attached to the chassis, and you can see it plugs in here. I believe they use this same chassis in a console, and from what I read in the console models, this power supply unit was mounted separately to the main chassis. Alright, let's flip it up and see if there's any monkey business going on underneath. Alright, the chassis looks pretty good underneath. Possibly untouched, which is the way I like them. Now these 3 little guys here are bias cells, and this set has 3 of them in it. And we'll probably have to replace those with something else. And we can put a little dry cell battery in there that'll last for years, because the current draw on that is virtually non-existent. And it looks like we got 3 of them wired in series. So what are these things, 1.5 volts a piece? I'm not sure, so that would give us 4.5 volts. That sounds about right. I don't think this is the way you're supposed to do this, but just for fun. Let's see if we got any juice left in these things. Nope, just as I figured, dead as a doornail. Dead as a doornail. Okay, I'll remove the cover, and we have the vibrator here. It's a synchronous self-rectifying type, and you can see down inside the cover they have some dampening material to cut back on the noise that it makes. I suppose the first order of business is put something in place of this rotten cable here, because all this looks pretty rotten. And we have 4 wires here. 2 of them provide power to the tube filaments, and the other 2 provide power to the vibrator assembly here. Well, I thought the cat had disappeared, so I let the big dog out, who despises cats, by the way. And he came out and immediately started sniffing around from around my patio area. And then pretty soon after, the cat darted out from under the patio and he chased it out of the backyard. Now, maybe the cat will stay gone now that it knows that there's a dog back here, but then again, maybe not. I guess time will tell. If it puts in another appearance, I'm probably going to call around and see if one of the animal shelters has a trap I can borrow. I've got an old trap that I bought 20 years ago when we had a rash of wildcats over here, and we were catching them, and animal control was coming to get them. Well, the trap was in a little accident, and besides that, after that, it just got left out in the yard for next to the fence for the past 15 years, so it's pretty much shot. I did get it out, and I was able to feed the cat some by hand, so I figured, well, I can throw some food up in the trap and lure it inside the trap and then let the door go. Well, that wasn't happening. That cat's either smart or it's been trapped before, and it gave me a look like, you've got to be kidding. I'm not going up in that thing. Even though I'm not a cat person, I don't want anything to happen to it, and I don't want my dog to get a hold of it, because if that happens, it's not going to end well for the cat. So, but with all that said, let's get back on the radio. As you can see, this wire is very heavy gauge, which will have to be replaced with something similar. I did measure across the power input, and I'm not getting anything at all, so I bet we have a bad switch. In fact, it doesn't seem like it's clicking right whenever I flip it on and off, so we may have to bypass that for now. Okay, I sprayed some juice in the power switch and kept working it back and forth. I'm now going to connect the speaker and commit the unpardonable sin and connect this to my Heathkit battery eliminator and see if we get any juice out of this. See if we get any kind of activity besides smoke and fire. Alright, here we go. Let's see what happens. Let's put this on 6 volts. Return to minimum. No current draw. That's a bit unusual. And nothing is happening. Okay, the vibrator is humming, but it's not acting in a way in which it should. So, do we have a stuck vibrator here? Could be. The thing probably hadn't been fired up in 80 years. Okay, this vibrator could probably be fixed if I could get inside of it, but I'm having a hard time getting inside of it. So what we may end up having to do is, for right now, is unplug the plug here, and we may have to insert the correct voltage into the chassis itself. One pin on here will be your 12 volt input, one pin will be your common ground, which will be the chassis, and the other end will be your B plus input to the chassis. Probably about 135 volts. I'll have to look and see what that is. Alright, we have the genuine rider's manual for this radio, or the rider schematic for this radio, contained in a great big thick rider's manual, volume 9 to be precise. It's one of the ones I happen to have, and it seems like the B plus for this is close to 150 volts. Now, what was common back in the day for sets like this, a lot of servicemen would remove all of this, install a regular power transformer and a rectifier tube socket and a filter condenser, and convert the set to run off of standard AC. But, you know, in today's world, that would take away most of the collectability value of it. So we're going to have to fix this if we can, to operate the way it originally did. Now we have this Zenith farm radio with a similar power supply in it. This is probably the one I should have chosen to work on, because this one is in relatively good shape. In fact, I believe we featured it in a video one time where we briefly powered it up and it tried to come to life. Well, anyway, I'm going to open it. I think it has the same vibrator as the Philco, and I want to stick the vibrator in the Philco and see what happens. And here we are, what looks like an original Zenith vibrator. Let's go stick it in the set, in the Philco chassis, and see what happens. Hopefully they're both the same. I suspect that they are. Alright, now let's see what happens. That vibrator is running to town. And we're getting a little current draw here. Oh, what about an amp? Probably should still be a little better than that though. And I'm hearing the vibrator hash in the speaker. Okay, we've got 110 volts B plus. It's probably a bit low. So now I think we need to dig into the power supply. Probably got some bad filters there, and I want to check on the buffer capacitor, because if it's bad, it can cremate this vibrator, and we don't need two of them cremated. Alright, here's the power unit opened up. It looks like we have a inductor here, 3 capacitors, another inductor right there, and then the transformer itself should be under here. And we have these 3 oddball electrolytics inside of the power supply. They look to be 6 microfarad, 200 volt, and they're all dead, open. The ground connection is the case, and they're bolted here to the frame here. Of course, our new ones won't connect like that. We'll just have to solder the negative end to the case here. Okay, 0.01 microfarad at 1000 working volts. Not surge volts, working voltage. That's because the back EMF produced by the vibrator transformer can cause quite a hefty spike there, so that's why you need the high working voltage there. I don't think I have any 0.01s at 1000 volts unless I can find a disc somewhere. It must be my lucky day, because I have exactly one 0.015 at 1500 or 1600 volts. That should work just fine. Okay, that film cap checked a little funny. It didn't check leaky, but on this meter the value was about twice what it should have been. And on the old school capacitor tester, I had a very faint blurry eye opening. And I've seen some of those old film caps do that. You know, when they were used in television, sometimes they would drift and get lossy and cause all kind of weird problems in the vertical circuit and that sort of thing. So what we've done is we took two 0.22 microfarad 630 volt capacitors and wired them in series. So that split our capacitance value in half down to 0.01 and our voltage adds. So both of these are 600 volts, actually 630 volts. So these are roughly good for 1200 volts now. So we'll just stick these in there and call it a day. And even these two together are still slightly shorter than this original one that's in there, so it should fit just fine. Okay, let's see how leaky the old buffer cap was. Virtually no eye opening here. Alright, 20 volts, 50 volts, whatever it is. Alright, that's pretty good. Well, got a little leakage at what, 300 volts. And of course, the higher we go, the worse it gets. And of course, we can't check this up to 1000. But yeah, it needed to go. Now we need to fight and put this power unit back together, and then we can replace these filter capacitors. Okay, I misspoke earlier. Those gray capacitors inside of the power supply are not electrolytics. They're actually 0.5 microfarad bypass capacitors. Our electrolytics are over here, right here, and I think those are in this big block on the rear of the chassis there. I don't think I have any 0.5s, or in this case 0.47, so I'll have to take some and put them in parallel to get what we need here. Okay, value wise this looks pretty good. Let's check it for leakage. Yeah, there got some leakage. So yeah, they need to go. Okay, we had the power unit rebuilt, and where the original bypass capacitors bolted to the chassis here, these new ones, the leads weren't long enough, so I had to solder them to the chassis here. But I'll put the bolts back in the unused holes there, so it won't look like somebody has messed with it from the outside. Okay, we now have the power supply back together with no leftover screws. Isn't that amazing? Alright, we have everything back in, so let's turn it on. That's good. You're hearing a little vibrator noise in the speaker, but that's all I'm hearing. Yeah, with the bias cells not active, then stands to reason it's probably not going to do much. But we'll do the same thing with this we do to every radio. Get the power supply going, and then get the audio circuit going, and then work our way back to the front end. Okay, with the antenna connected, I'm hearing a little static. So let's tune across the band and see if I get anything. This thing is unbelievably hard to tune. Yep, we're hearing a little something. And knocked my antenna off again, really good. Yep, so we have a little signal passage, that's a good sign. Alright, checking the plate voltage of the 186, which is the first audio tube. We're supposed to have about 55 volts. We're getting about 88, which is too much. And when I touch the control grid pin of said tube, I'm getting a negative voltage on it, but I should also be hearing a little buzz in the speaker when I touch my finger to it, and we're not hearing that. So I'm inclined to think our problem is in the audio stage, but right now we're going to get the signal tracer and see what we have there at the control grid of the first audio tube. We should have pure audio there. Okay, we're connected, so let's turn the signal tracer on and see what we get. Bad connection to the signal tracer there, apparently. Well, what kind of crap is this? Well, the radio still has output, but why is the signal generator misbehaving? Might have to dig out the tube signal. I said generator, I meant tracer. Might have to dig out the tube signal tracer that won't load the circuit down like the solid state one may do. Okay, there it is. Poor connection there.
What did you get the booster for?
As you can hear, we have a very stout signal
Well, that's a good question. I talked about it because it's related.
coming out of the signal tracer.
I know we get tired of COVID. I know we're fed up with talking about it. Here comes BA5 variant. I call it the midterm variant. They're going to ramp stuff up just in time for the midterms.
Yeah, we have a very stout signal going into the control grid of the first audio tube, so that definitely tells us that our problem is in the audio circuit.
But I'll bet they will in California.
Alright, checking the control grids of the push-pull output tube. We have negative 1.8 on pin 4. And then moving to pin 5, we have positive 6.3. So that don't seem to be right, does it? Okay, I just done some online research and discovered that the replacement vibrator that I need is a Mallory number 246, and of course I looked on eBay and there's not any listed, so I'm going to have to be on the lookout for one of those, because I really don't have any confidence that I'm going to be able to repair the original one, at least not long term anyway. Alright, what I want to do next is get the signal tracer back out, and then we're going to probe the control grid of the first audio tube, and then we're going to move to the plate of the first audio tube, and it stands to reason that the signal will be louder as heard over the signal generator coming out of the first audio tube. Damn, I just can't. Signal generators, signal tracers, I'm just having a problem with that today. So we're going to get the signal tracer out, and we're going to probe the control grid of the first audio tube, and I anticipate the signal will still be there. And then we will probe the plate of the first audio tube, and if that stage is working correctly, then it stands to reason that the signal as heard over the signal tracer will be louder than it was on the input side, on the grid side, and I bet it's not going to be. Okay, we're ready to probe this, only this time we're using the probe set that I ordered for this signal tracer. This is pin 6, the control grid.
I'm just on a roll today. I'm in a good place.
And we have the radio's volume control turned way down, as well as the volume control on this signal tracer.
An old friend comes in out of nowhere to
there we go. You can tell we have a good stout signal there. Alright, let's move back to pin 3, the plate.
sports at Bet Rivers Sports.
Okay.
Rivers is the trusted name in online sports betting.
As you can tell, our signal is much more robust there.
Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
So that tells us that our first audio stage is working. Control grid, which is the input, plate, which is the output.
You're not allowed to be there. Yes, when you can't find.
Now this signal tracer has a capacitor in it to block any DC from making its way to the internal circuitry and possibly damaging something. So our first audio stage is working. So the trouble is either going to be in the phase inverter stage or the audio output stage itself. And just to give you a better idea, I have the gain control on the signal tracer turned all the way down. We have the volume control on the radio turned up loud enough just to get a usable signal. We're on the control grid of the tube, which is the input. Now we'll move over to the plate, which is pin 3. That'll be our output. And as you can tell, it's much louder now. So this stage is working. Alright, I'm looking at the grids of the output tube 4 and 5, and I had to turn the volume on the radio all the way up. And you can tell we're just barely getting anything here. Yeah, problem between the first audio tube and the control grids of the audio output tube. Now let's look at the phase inverter, which is the type 1H4 tube here. Let's see what we have on the control grid of that, which looks to be pin 5. And at pin 5, the control grid of the phase inverter, I'm not getting anything. Right, let's look at the voltage here on pin 5 of the phase inverter tube, the control grid. And we have a negative voltage there, so that's okay. But I want to look at those resistors in that stage there and make sure those haven't gone way up in value. Okay, so we're at the plate once again of the first audio tube. As you can hear, we have a stout signal. This is the coupling capacitor that connects to, one end connects to the plate, and the other end connects to, well, one side of it connects to directly to the grid of one of the sections of the audio output tube, and then there's a resistor that comes off of that, and then it also goes to the phase inverter tube. So let's see what's on the other end of this capacitor. Nothing but vibrator hash. No audio, so our problem is right in here. Could it be that this capacitor is open? It doesn't happen much, but it does happen. Alright, we have the capacitor disconnected. We're on the plate of the first audio tube. We have audio there, as you can hear. Now let's move to the disconnected, unloaded into the cap and see what we have. We have nothing. So this capacitor is definitely open. Alright, I had the plate side of our capacitor temporarily tacked in. I left the grid side dangling for a reason. Plate, audio. Now let's go to the grid side that will soon be connected to the grid side anyway. Audio, as you can tell. So that proves that this guy here is wide open. Okay, we have the capacitor temporarily tacked into place. Now let's turn it on and see what happens. Alright, turn the volume up.
Gonna get annihilated that league unless they. I don't know how you can.
That's a lot better, isn't it?
Team in the Rose Bowl.
Now we need to tackle that vibrator hash, and changing the filter capacitors will probably help that. Those are in that block back there, and I'm sure they're dried out by now.
Like they've even been a little under the radar just because of conferences. That's fair. That's fair, but the likelihood of you going on the road and playing Indiana and Purdue in back-to-back games and winning Michigan State. Now, the only thing they have going for them is they have a coach who their style is basically Big Ten style.
Sounds like we got a stage trying to break off into oscillation here, probably due to a bypass capacitor that's either open or very leaky and not doing its job. So tired of this antenna wire keep continuing to fall off. Okay, I think our local oscillator was dropping out. You know, we talked about that before when the oscillator and mixer tube gets slightly weak, and if the filament voltage drops below a certain point, it'll stop oscillating, and I think that's what happened. I slightly increased the input voltage to the radio, and it came back to life. So
I'm going to tell you next.
This is the Doug Godley Show on Fox Sports Radio. The NFL is never...
Alright, let's kill the power. And just for fun, let's test this capacitor on the old school tester and see if we get anything. Okay, as you can see on the meter, it's registering 0, wide open, which we knew it was, but just wanted to hook it up to the test equipment and show you how it would measure. Now for fun, let's hook it up to the old school capacitance tester and see how we rate. This is a 0.01 microfarad, and as you can tell, no eye opening. What about leakage? Yep, wide open. Okay, I know sometimes I can jump around and be confusing, so I'll try to plainly recap what all we've done up to this point and hope it makes sense. First of all, we discovered that the off-on switch was not making good connection, but spraying it with control cleaner and working it back and forth a number of times seemed to have helped it, which seems to be the case with a lot of radios. Then we discovered that the original 6-pin synchronous vibrator was dead, and I borrowed one out of a Zenith radio that I'm going to work on one day to put in the Philco chassis, and got that working. Then, as a precaution, we opened up the power supply unit and we replaced the buffer capacitor and the 3 RF interference suppression capacitors. When you change a vibrator, you always want to change the buffer capacitor, or at least check to see if it's been replaced with a newer type of capacitor that's still good, because if the buffer capacitor is bad, the back EMF from the power transformer will cause a very high voltage spike to appear across the vibrator points, which will in turn cause the points to arc and burn up in short order. And here's the buffer capacitor right here, a 0.01 microfarad. As you can see, it's across the winding here on the transformer. And it also goes back to the points on the vibrator. The original was a 0.01 microfarad, 1000 volt. We took two 0.022 microfarads at 630 volts and wired them in series, which have the capacitance to approximately 0.01 microfarad, and doubled our working voltage. And here are 3 interference suppression capacitors here, a 0.5, a 0.5 here, and then a 0.5 here. Well, then we got the vibrator to where we could run it and feel safe about it not burning up, but there was no other action from the radio, and I determined a good place to start with that is to substitute a voltage for these 3 dead bias cells that are wired in series to give us 3 volts, 1 volt per cell. Those cells are needed to provide grid bias voltage to our tubes. So what we have done temporarily, we just simply took a couple of D cells, wired them in series to get 3 volts, and wired them in circuit. When the post office gets their butt in gear, we'll have a lithium-ion 3-volt memory battery backup battery with solder tabs showing up, and we will install that in the radio. The current drain is virtually non-existent, and that new battery should last until it just dies from old age, which should be a number of years from now. And here's the bias cell right here. You see the positive terminal connects to the chassis, and then our negative terminal comes up through this resistor, all up through here, provides negative grid bias to the phase inverter tube as well as to the audio output tube, which is actually 2 tubes in one for push-pull operation. And it also comes back up and provides negative grid bias for the first audio and detector tube. So no negative grid bias, no worky. So once we replace the bias cell with our temporary D battery combination, we had very, very faint radio reception coming through the speaker. So we took our signal tracer. Yeah, I got it right that time. I didn't call it a generator. So we took our signal tracer, placed the audio probe here on the control grid of the first audio tube, and we had a stout signal there. Well, it stands to reason. This is an amplifier stage. If we move it from the control grid to the plate of said tube, we should get an even stronger signal, which we did. So then I moved over and checked for the presence of a signal on the control grids of the audio output tube here and here, and also on the control grid of the phase inverter tube right there, and we had basically zippo, nothing. So that told us that the problem lies somewhere between here and here. Now normally these coupling capacitors don't just open, they become leaky and act like a resistor and pass both AC and DC when they should only be passing just AC. But in this case, this coupling capacitor here was wide open. We determined that by once again placing our signal tracer audio probe on the plate of the first audio tube and had a stout signal, and then moved our probe over to the other end of this capacitor that connects to one of the grids of the audio output tube, and through this resistor down to the grid of the phase inverter tube, and there was not one thing at this point, which led us to believe that that coupling capacitor was open. But just to make sure something in the circuit here wasn't loading down the signal, I lifted one end of this capacitor, rechecked at the plate, stout signal, checked our signal again at the end of the capacitor that we cut loose, not a darn thing, totally nothing. So we replaced that capacitor with a new 0.01 microfarad capacitor, and our volume level returned to the speaker. I think at this point, I don't think there's going to be any exotic troubleshooting procedures needed from this point on out unless something goes haywire, and that could very well happen. I think this is going to be pretty much be a case here on out of just replacing all of the out of tolerance capacitors and resistors and replacing the ratty looking battery cable and installing our bias cell, which like I said will be a lithium battery. Cleaning all the controls. The tuning condenser is very stiff, very hard to turn. That's going to need to be cleaned and lubricated, and doing an alignment on it, and this radio will be good to go. Well, of course, we'll have to find us another vibrator, and like I said, I can't find one on eBay right now, which is about par for the course. eBay's like everything else. They have everything but what you need. I think there's a solid state vibrator replacement for this, but I'd really rather stick with the original type of technology if possible. And also, I've heard some of these solid state vibrators are not what all they're cracked up to be. As far as the battery cable, I found some heavy gauge speaker wire on eBay, zip type cord, red and black. We're going to use that. And I ordered some new alligator clips for the battery connectors. And if I can slip the old wiring out of this cloth sheathing here, what's left of it, I'll slip it back over the new wiring, but if I can't, no big deal. They also have the, like I said in the beginning of the video, they have the filament wires running separate from the power supply wires for the vibrator assembly here. What I'm probably going to end up doing is just connecting the filament wires under here instead of having two sets of wires coming out of the back of the radio, if you follow that. But I'm pretty sure this radio was probably operational whenever it was put into storage. It was probably a case of whoever had it got AC power, didn't need the 6-volt tractor radio anymore, so it got shoved in the barn or wherever and was never thought of again until whoever owned the property died and they had the great clean out and found it, and somebody bought it at the estate sale for $2 and then sold it to me on eBay for, well, a good bit more than that. So, you know, that's just the way it is. And here are our filter capacitors. It looks like we have a 4 microfarad and 8 microfarad. And as I mentioned, those appear to be in that block on the rear of the chassis. And I think once we replace those, the vibrator noise we hear in the speaker will go down drastically. What you're basically hearing in the speaker is the equivalent of the 60 cycle or 120 cycle hum that you would hear, depending on if you had a radio with full wave or half wave rectification if the filters went bad. So just look at it that way. The filters in this set are basically open and not filtering out the noise being produced by the vibrator running. So we'll need to replace those next, I think. And here we are turned on with the volume all the way down. You can hear the noise we're talking about. And yes, you should probably hear a little noise, but not this much noise.
Who accuse them of having some level of knowledge of what Deshaun wants.
And actually, this speaker sounds better than I figured it would. I mean, it still doesn't sound as good as a standard PM or electrodynamic speaker, but it doesn't sound as tinny as some I've heard like this.
Coming up next, you want to know what to bet on this weekend?
Okay, now I want to test the coupling capacitor between the plate of the phase inverter and the control grid of one of the sections of the output tube, and that capacitor is contained in this black box here that I believe actually contains 2 capacitors. This is the plate side on the phase inverter, and we have 80 volts. That's to be expected. Now let's look at the control grid side that goes to the output tube. We have 7 volts positive. That is very leaky, and if we let it keep playing like that, it could destroy that output tube, and I think those dual section output tubes are a little bit pricey. So we'll want to replace that capacitor too. Taking these block capacitors apart and restuffing them is really not too terribly difficult. It's not like restuffing an Atwater Kent tar box. And also the speaker coil resistance is correct. One half is 400, the other half is 500, so no concern there. Okay, normally I can do these without even unsoldering anything from them, but this one is so packed up in here, and has so much stuff connected to it, we may have no other choice but to unsolder this and take it completely out. Now I'm still trying to trace if there's anything else in here besides the one capacitor. They may be just using this center lug as a tie point, but we'll know that more once we get it out and once I trace the schematic more. It's one thing you always want to be careful of with these Philco block condensers, because more times than not there's more than one component inside, and you want to make sure you know where they go. You don't want to put anything in incorrect. So, and you don't want to put, say, a .001 where a .01 is supposed to go and things like that. So you want to make doubly sure what you're doing, and the best way to do that is to have a schematic in front of you and trace the schematic as well as trace the wiring in the set, and usually if you're paying attention you'll be in good shape. Okay, I was looking at the video footage and the schematic, and there's nothing tied to this center point here internally. The reason we know that, up here you can see where they have the component leads of the internal capacitor wrapped around here and down here and soldered, but on this center lug there's nothing, so all they're using this center lug for is a tie point. Okay, this is going to be a bit tedious, but we're going to have to do it. We'll add some solder to all of these connections to make it easier to unsolder. You know, when solder is 80 plus years old, it kind of wants to be stubborn as far as coming off. And then we'll use our desoldering braid and our solder sucker tool to get as much of the solder off as we can, and then gently try to pry loose and unwind everything from each terminal, and then we should be able to remove this. Okay, I got it out, but before we tear it apart, let's connect the leakage tester to it just for fun and see how much leakage this has. Okay, very blurred out, narrow eye opening. Let's check for leakage. Oh yeah, you see it's very leaky at even 50 volts. And of course, the higher we go, the worse it's going to get. That's on the 200 volt scale. That's closer to the amount of voltage it would see in the set. So yeah, that capacitor is basically, well, electrically it's basically shorted really. And this potting material comes out pretty easy. You can use a corkscrew or a soldering iron or a heat gun, but preferably a soldering iron that you don't normally use for electronic work, to melt this out. And then you need to unsolder here where the leads come through. Actually, what you can do is just snip those off for the moment and then unsolder them, and then you should be able to pull the whole thing out. Or actually, you can just dig the stuff out and you can see the capacitor down in there. Okay, we have it all cleaned out. There's the innards. Ready to insert the new capacitor and solder it in place. And this 490K resistor is way out of tolerance, so it's going to get replaced too. So yeah. Okay, there's the new film capacitor in place. Now all we have to do is wrap the leads around the terminal lugs here and solder them in place, and then cut the excess off. Okay, now the leads are mechanically in place and crimped and ready to be soldered. We're going to solder to the tabs here, as well as run some solder down in the holes here, just like they had it from the factory. Okay, there it is, all soldered and ready to go. Now, if you want to fill this thing back up with wax or tar or hot glue or whatever, then by all means do it, but it's totally unnecessary. You don't have to fill it with anything, and whenever it's mounted in the on the chassis, then you won't even be able to tell that this is opened up from the bottom. Okay, we have everything back in place. Need to clean this up a little bit. This 1 meg resistor that was out of tolerance, I just have this in temporarily tacked on for now, because This stuff here needs to be checked and replaced, especially this capacitor here, but like I normally do, I like to see which direction I'm going in before I get too carried away. In case we end up going in a backwards direction, then I'll know what needs to be looked into. Well, we must have done something right. It's still playing.
The Department of Health and Human Services says deliveries will arrive in the...
And I think it gets louder now, and as expected, it doesn't distort at high volumes as bad as it was doing
before. The United States has supplied to almost 7 million doses. NASCAR drivers this weekend are making their way to Motor Speedway for the Ambetter 301 green flag drop. WMOX.
Okay. Now, is this when we go off the air and stay off the air all night with a dead carrier, unmodulated carrier? This station's sort of bad about doing that too.
Ken Coleman Show, you guessed it, Ken Coleman. And we are here to take your call, America, on your money, your life, whatever you're grappling with, career changes, we would love to help.
I told you this thing was stiff. Let's see if I can tune it. They claim to be the only gospel station in the area. Well, they may be the only black gospel station in the area.
In my job.
But they are not the only gospel station in the area.
For a year and a half, so you're supposed to do that whole 3 to 5 years thing.
Alright, I've about had all the fun I can stand with this radio for today, so we're going to shut it down, and we'll come back down and deal with it some more at a later time. Alright, here's the filter capacitor block out of the Philco, and it's totally dead as far as reading any capacitance value here. As you can tell, no eye opening whatsoever. Leakage wise, 20 volts, 50 volts, whatever that is, nothing. 200 volts, yeah, that's start to get some leakage at 300 volts. Of course, that's more voltage than you'll ever see in the radio, but it's basically dried up, no capacitance value. 1.7 for that particular section, and 1.5 for that section. Yeah, that's the reason we had the noise in the speaker. And it would have been noisier than that had it not been for the filter choke. The filter choke was taking care of a good bit of it, but we still need these capacitors too to get rid of all of it. So we'll do that. We'll put this block back on the chassis for appearance sake and wire a couple of modern capacitors under the chassis. Okay, this big block contains one 8 microfarad and one 4 microfarad. Working voltage not specified, but given the B plus of the chassis, this is probably a 250 volt rated cap, maybe even 200. We're going to go with 250s as replacements. These two things here, one is a 10, one is a 4.7. You can see how much smaller 21st century capacitors are versus 1938 capacitors, and that's a good thing when it comes to installing capacitors under a chassis. Okay, we have the caps replaced and we still have some noise in the speaker,
For an extra 20
but I think our volume is more now.
That's code STUFF.
Alright, let's connect our meter and see what the B plus is now. Alright, schematic says 147.
Hey to me, right? Hey, the sun's never made
161.
contract off.
Well, that's a little high, but that could be because we're using a high impedance meter here that's not loading the circuit down like an old school meter would have done, like what would have been available when this radio was new, but I'd rather the B plus be a little high than be substantially low.
All of that
And I think when I measured the B plus prior to the cap replacement, it was something like 80 something volts. I can't remember if I showed that on camera or not, but so yeah, those capacitors brought the B plus back up, and it also brought our volume up too. Alright, the next thing I want to get rid of are these plate bypass capacitors, one connected from each output tube plate to ground. Those are also contained in a Bakelite block, and if one of those was to short, it could burn open the winding on the speaker there, and we certainly don't want that to happen, so let's just go ahead and get those out of the equation. Okay, so this here is our ground, so 1004 will go from here to here, and the other 0.004 will go from here to here. Well, this is interesting. I have my bias disconnected, and the radio is still playing.
And trade demands are a big piece of that story.
Well, and two, it's just gonna be real hard to tell somebody you gotta be happy with their job, bro. Like, or else. Like, what do you mean? Like, that's impossible to say. Like, and the average person, listen, don't like going to work, right? And sure, you know, KD loves to go hoop, or just, but guys in general, right? Most people don't enjoy going to work. Like, we're blessed. I won't speak for you. I like coming in here and talking.
Yeah, interesting. But we're going to have it there anyway. It's supposed to be there. We're going to have it there. Okay, another one I had to remove completely just to make things easier. But before we tear this apart, let's do the usual and check it for leakage, just for entertainment value. Alright, getting a very narrow eye opening. So that's a bad start. Okay, that's not too bad. At 200 volts. Yep, got a little leakage happening there. Certainly not the worst I've ever seen, but considered unacceptable anyway. Let's check the other section. Alright, this section's giving me an even worse eye opening. 200 volts. Yep, that section's leaky too. Maybe a little more so than the first section. Alright, here we are cleaned up. We haven't re-stuffed it yet. If you'll notice, there's a number here on the side. What is that? 3324 DU, or is that an 8 that's been marked out? Wasn't engraved well, but anyway, I believe there was a publication. I can't remember who sold it. Maybe Antique Electronics Supply, that was nothing but a book on these Philco Bakelite block condensers, and it showed a schematic as well as what was contained in each block based on this number here. So that would be a handy publication to have, especially if you're a beginner and working on these older Philcos with these types of condensers in them that were used from what, about 1930 pretty extensively through the 30s, and then in the early 40s they were still used in some applications, but not as widespread as they once were. Alright, enough babbling. Let me dig all this crap out and stuff a couple of new capacitors in here. Okay, I've dug out a good bit of the gunk, and you can see the two capacitors down in here, one on each side of the enclosure. Of course, once we get the rest of the gunk dug out in the old capacitors, the new capacitors won't take up nearly as much space. Okay, we have the capacitor housing completely cleaned out of its innards, and we're ready to put the new capacitors in place. Remember, this top lug up here closest to the mounting hole, that is our common lug here. Okay, here are our 2.0047 capacitors in place. Now, I used an axial lead for one and a radial lead for the other one to make it easier to install, and we have the values visible, so if someone needs to pull this out and look at it, they can pull it out and flip it up and see what value capacitors are there. Yeah, that's better focus there. Now I want to clean this up a little bit, and then we'll be ready to put it back in the radio and solder everything back up. Okay, we have the capacitor back in place. Our ground's connected here. Our bias supply temporarily connected here. Our 2 plates connected here, and I chose to connect the speaker cables over to this side here. That way, if I have to disconnect one lead for something, it'll be easier to do so. Alright, so let's fire it up and see if it still works. Alright, it's still working fine.
Are you kidding me?
Well, except for the vibrator noise. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to look for any bypass capacitors, like from the B+ line to ground or screen grid to ground. Pretty much any capacitor that one end is connected to chassis ground here, it has high voltage on the other side. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of it.
It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up.
Okay, this big honking one right here. One end connects to the incoming 6.3 volts, and the other end connects to ground here. Or does it? Oh no, it doesn't, but actually this feels kind of loose here, like it might be open here at the end. Let's take this out and check it further. Okay, this resistor was out of tolerance. The original was a 32K. I had a 33K. It would not stretch down to this terminal, so I was able to unwind, where is it, that resistor right there, and wind it up closer to the connection, and there was a little bit of pigtail left, so I was able to attach to that. I have this bypass capacitor disconnected. We have 6 volts on one side, the input side, and what do we have on the output side? 4.3. So yeah, that capacitor is very leaky, on the verge of basically being shorted. Well, we know this bypass cap is leaky because it was passing DC through it, so oh yeah, you can see it. Even 50 volts here, it blinks, and then at 200 volts it's really bad. Of course, it only has 6 volts on the other side, but as we saw, it had 6 volts going in and 4.8 coming out, so that's very leaky. In the new capacitor, I had to add an extra length of wire because the leads on it were not long enough. I don't like doing that, but when the leads on the new part are not long enough, then there's really not a whole lot you can do. Alright, MOX apparently went off the air, so I had to put it on the black gospel station. I'm still getting some vibrator hash, but it doesn't appear to be as bad as it was.
Prince say he held him responsible for the journalist's murder. Saudi Foreign Affairs Minister Adel Al-Jubeir backed up the prince to CBS News.
The charges that the Crown Prince knew about it, or much less ordered it, are ridiculous.
The Crown Prince has long denied involvement in Khashoggi's killing, repeating as much to Biden during their meeting on Friday. This is USA Radio News.
Wendy Bell here for my friends at Swiss America. Special offered.
Yeah, it seems like every time we hear the news, we hear something new that 427 has done that is embarrassing or otherwise hurtful to the average American.
Participating in sports based on their gender identity. U.S. District Judge Charles Ashley, a Trump appointee, agreed with their argument and issued a temporary...
Actually, I stand behind the LGBTQ movement. Yeah, let's get Brandon to quit. I'm also interested in this 0.1 microfarad filament bypass capacitor. It connects to the filament of the IF amplifier tube and the first audio and detector tube. And since these are directly heated cathodes, which means the filament and cathode are one and the same, any kind of interference that makes its way to that point could be amplified and be heard over the speaker. So I want to get rid of that one, that 19.1 microfarad. Then we have another one here, another 0.1 microfarad, capacitor 18, and it looks like a screen grid bypass capacitor for the output tube. That one could cause oscillation, but right now I'm more interested in 19 here. Okay, I'll replace that cathode slash filament bypass capacitor. Actually, I only have the ground end temporarily connected because we have these other two capacitors here that look like bypass caps. One of them here looks like a dual section capacitor, and replacing that bypass capacitor got our interference down a little bit, but it's still there.
Every single Saturday is our Fox Sports Radio NFL Insiders.
It is to the point now where when I turn the volume up,
Adam, a year.
it's not so noticeable. And I suspect that even under normal conditions, there's going to be a little bit of vibrator hash heard in the audio. That's just the way it is. And speaking of vibrators,
Teams having that kind of.
I was doing some more looking for a new old stock Mallory vibrator. What did I say it was? A 246? And even though I said I'd kind of want to keep the technology original, I may end up going to a solid state vibrator. There's a company that makes boards that are pretty much universal that can replace most any type of vibrator. I think they're based out of Florida, and everything I've seen and read about them has been positive. Unlike some of the reviews I've seen for some of the other solid state vibrators, this one that they sell appears to be top notch and does not cause any issues. I was watching a video on YouTube by a gentleman who was repairing a 1940s Delco car radio, and he used the solid state vibrator from Antique Electronics Supply, and it caused the interference to increase and the B plus to decrease. It was just a poorly designed part. Of course, that vibrator wouldn't work in this radio anyway, but there's a company, like I said, that sells boards that you can stuff inside of an old vibrator housing. I think they're about between $45 and $50, and given that those boards are professionally made, that's really a very reasonable price when you think about it. I know I would rather just pay the $45 or $50 than trying to design something using surface mounted components that would be neat and fit inside of a vibrator can. So yeah, when the time comes, I'm probably just going to order one of those solid state boards and stuff it inside of the original Philco vibrator can and put this Zenith vibrator back in the radio in which it came out of. And here's the other 0.1, a screen bypass capacitor for both the IF amplifier and oscillator and mixer tubes. Alright, here's that dual capacitor, number 12. It's a dual 0.05 microfarad. One appears to be another cathode slash filament slash heater, whatever you choose to call it, bypass capacitor. And the other one looks to be an AVC filter. So let's change that out. Alright, I'm just going ahead and replacing these other capacitors. They're all bypass capacitors and they all need to go anyway. And I'll say I'm really not a fan of these types of terminals on these Philco tube sockets. They don't have an eyelet where you can just run the wire through the hole and wrap it around and crimp it. You have to wrap the wire around the whole terminal, and I just really don't like that all that well. But at least these are not Loctile tube sockets. Loctiles weren't quite here in 1938. Those didn't appear to win 39 or 40, something like that. In my opinion, they should have never appeared at all. The Loctile tube, that was the worst kind of tube socket ever made, in my opinion. Yeah, the thought was nice to have a tube that would mechanically remain in the socket, especially in use in car radios, but they sucked. The pins on the tube are so small that they corrode easily and make poor contact in the socket. The sockets will break if you're not careful. It's just not a good idea. What they should have done was stuck with octal tubes and used a tube retainer clip to hold the tubes in socket. The octals are my favorite types too, by the way. Okay, I have these other bypass capacitors changed, 3 of them to be precise, in the AVC filter. This one, unfortunately, I had to J-hook because once again the capacitor lead was not long enough to extend from point A to point B, but you have to do those kind of things sometimes.
Back here in the States,
Alright, that didn't really help things much, even though all of those capacitors checked leaky.
That the number of monkeypox cases will continue to swell
The monkeypox
through at least
cases.
August, as the Biden administration says it is
I
changing
think
the
some
way
people in my
Russian
neighborhood already have
vaccines
that
to
disease,
combat the
but I
growing
won't
outbreak.
say
As of
anything else
Friday,
about
at
that.
least 1,000.
Okay, all the caps are changed. Admittedly, not my best work, but some of these I had to J-hook because of lead length issues. And there were a couple of them that were very hard to get to that I just said screw it, and they look a little sloppy, and so be it. Chances are I'm probably the last one that's ever going to look under this thing, so. Now we can hear we still have the vibrator hash in the speaker.
I'm here on Fox Sports Radio.
It's not so bad
Just
when
been
you,
enjoying
when you
because
turn
my
the volume up, but I think a good quality solid state vibrator would be an improvement with this radio. I'm actually getting more noise out of the speaker than what I'm getting out of the actual vibrator itself up here. It's actually pretty quiet.
Really?
To a whopper, it gives me the same sensation of scratching on a chalkboard.
Alright, I cleaned the tuning shaft, had some hard grease in it, sprayed a little contact cleaner on it, and it freed right up.
One of the movies you've seen before. You watched it?
Yeah, we're getting some DX here. It's about 10 minutes to 8 in the evening. Now keep in mind this set has not been aligned yet, and that will probably be one of the last things I do. Right now I'm kind of at a standstill. I need my new wire to show up so I can redo this battery cable, and I need my lithium-ion memory backup battery to show up. I did notice, listening a little carefully, that when I remove the bias voltage, the volume gets slightly lower, but it still works.
I was really trying to look for what connects in.
There's a country station high up on the dial.
Were you high?
That could be 1490 out of Neshoba County. And if it is, that's pretty good.
We generally insert recession for bad.
Okay, that's it.
Value with this next Saturday,
Oh
so
my God.
Don will be able to.
I'm looking. Peak growth numbers just a second.
MVP GOP's bonus days are here for...
For the good time.
And Al Green, that's probably the station,
For the good time.
that high school station out of what? Trying to think, Baton Rouge, is that where it's from? Yeah, I suspect that's the station out in Louisiana that...
Can help lower cholesterol.
Now he's having...
Turn this off so I don't get a copyright strike. See if I can catch a station ID. Okay, is this KAAY in Little Rock? I thought they were supposed to drastically reduce their power to the point where couldn't anybody pick them up outside of the primary coverage area. I think they had some tower damage, and rather than fix it, they just decided just to cut their power back and go with what they had, so to speak. I don't know, but given the dial position, probably it seems like they always fade out when I want them to get a station ID.
Having the right people just makes life easier. WMEJ, AM1180 and FM 104.3 Avoid waxing papers. Cardboard can be recycled as long as it's not saturated with food and grease. And don't forget to remove
Is this the Black Information Network?
Now that's an easy list.
Also known as the Black Lives Matter station.
Hero to our planet. I'm Terrence Bibb on the Black Information
Yep, I guessed it.
1280 AM WODT, New Orleans, the Black Information Network.
BINNewsNewOrleans.com on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at BIN News New Orleans. Tell your smart device to play New Orleans BIN 1280 on iHeartRadio. I'm Vanessa Tyler.
And I'm Mike Stevens.
Very on.
Yeah. That's a stop.
Iran to see weapons-capable drones that it may want to acquire to use in Ukraine. Wisconsin GOP Congressman Mike Gallagher blaming a recruiting shortfall in the armed forces on the growing perception that the military is being politicized under the Biden administration.
That it's increasingly woke. We've seen the encroachment of dangerous diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucrats into the Department of Defense.
Congressman Gallagher was appearing on the Salem Radio Network. Also at srnnews.com. Very frightening moments Friday night at a major California airport. Shelley Adler has that story.
Add another headache for airline
passengers. The San Francisco Airport's international terminal was evacuated last night due to a bomb threat. The police department there says the bomb threat was reported around 8:15 local time, and authorities discovered a suspicious package. Investigators at the airport deemed the item possibly incendiary. A man was taken into custody, but no other details were immediately available. Police say the terminal reopened about 4 hours later at midnight.
What's going on, everybody? Hope you're enjoying your Saturday.
With a number of lists. This is SRN News.
Your
Sounds
spouse
pretty good.
has said your marriage is over. They're ready to walk out.
Except for the vibrator hash, but I think we've improved that about as far as we're going to be able to improve it, short of replacing this vibrator with a solid state one.
By saying he was not personally responsible for the murder and that the action was taken against those who were responsible. With the USA Radio News Los Angeles Bureau, I'm Ellie Andrews.
The president left the Middle East without explicit assurances that the Saudis will pump more oil to ease gas prices. But Saudi Foreign Affairs Minister Adel Al-Jubeir told CBS News that it likely won't help the U.S.
Iraq has a shortage of refining capacity. No refinery has been built in decades.
You're listening to USA Radio News.
David was in big trouble with the IRS. At first, I didn't.
Nothing on the low end of the band yet.
Fresh start. Call 800.
Unbeliever slipped way out of line. When that happened,
A lead-off single. State's solution to the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
He says Israel must remain.
I about had all I can stand of this today, so we're going to call it a day for now. Okay, we're out here in the daytime, and we are barely picking up 1490 out of Neshoba County, so this is not too bad, considering it hasn't been aligned yet. Alright, I just tweaked the IFs by ear a little bit. There's the other station out of Jackson.
Determine how.
But that's about all we're getting right now.
Couldn't live at their own home for some reason.
Fostering help saves lives.
Yeah.
If the mama dog and her puppies would have stayed in
But right now I'm at a standstill on this until I get my battery cable in and my bias battery, so I can get rid of these things here. Back on the Philco, we had some things finally show up in the mail. A couple of nice fresh new battery clips here, although I'm sure they're not as robust as what was originally on the radio. We have some cable here. This is actually speaker wire, 10 feet of it, but it's heavy enough to do what we need to do. I'll cut it in half and put about 5 feet on the radio. Originally they had the filament wiring and the B+ wiring that powers the vibrator supply running out the back and then tied together at the clips. I think I'm going to tie the filament wiring up inside the radio and only have this cable coming out of the back of the radio. And right here we have our 3-volt solder in lithium-ion batteries for the bias supply. So let's get down here and get to it. We now have the lithium-ion battery in place with the positive end oriented towards the chassis, and we're reading 3.2 volts.
Sir, you know,
okay, I have the battery cable replaced.
I'm just going to be doing my job as a citizen.
And instead of running, like I said previously, instead of having the filament and the vibrator leads running out separately out the back, I just coupled them under the chassis under here. It makes it look better, and it works all the same.
Not let them in your house, and don't show them your guns, okay? 866 Talk Gun will get you in here. Let's see here. Line 1, Zona, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's get Zona in here. Hey there.
Hey there.
What's going on?
Okay, so I have I believe what is called a long gun, which belonged to my dad. In fact, when I was about 16, I remember him taking me down to the bayou, doing a little target practice with it.
Okay.
It is an H-B high standard, and it has written on it patent pending. So I went online.
I think we're about to the point of stopping on this chassis right now and ordering a solid state vibrator to put in here.
Got it originally, nor how much.
And then we can put the Zenith vibrator back where it belongs. I probably should order 2 solid state vibrators, and that way when the one that's going to go back in the Zenith set decides to take a dump, I'll have one, because it'll be just my luck that by the time I need one for the Zenith, the little boards won't be available anymore.
And they get all upset about, oh, ghost guns, they don't have serial numbers. Yeah, well, a lot of guns were made. And just walk in there and say, guys, I got this thing.
It's just, sometimes I can't pick up that music. But listen tonight, I want you to realize
injustice of having to play through a segregated time in our country.
yes. That's the book of Proverbs. I may not have quoted it word for word, but it's in there.
Okay.
Okay, that's
Good deal. And it's just hard for me to do it without looking at it and on the fly live. But they can take some time and look that up.
About an
There you go. You
amp.
got 2 sources, Jim's guns.
I noticed the label on the back, whoever put it there said 1.6 amps, 6 volt, 1.6 amps.
Thank you, Zona. You do.
Now, some vibrator sets, if I haven't mentioned this before, draw more than that because they're using standard 6 or 12 volt tubes, whatever the case may be for the application. And when you add all those up, that just adds more current there. This set, they're using standard 2 volt battery tubes and wired to where they can operate off of 6 volts, and those tubes draw less current. So Philco was really thinking there about coming up with a set that wouldn't be as strenuous on the battery.
When I shot a deer with a 44 mag, it would usually run anywhere from 10 to maybe 15, 20 yards at the very most. I mean, no problem like that. But every single one of them that I hit.
And our bias voltage is 3.2 volts. Like I said, this cell will last a long time.
Less than a 43.
And as we demonstrated, the radio will play without it, but after I was listening a little more carefully, I think there is a little more volume with the correct bias voltage applied.
Every shot was pretty well placed. I took.
For now, we have the radio back together. I still need to replace the dial bulb. Probably need to touch the alignment up a little bit, clean up a few loose ends, but all that can wait until I order that little vibrator board, and I think that's probably going to be devoted to another video since this one's drawn out longer than I wanted it to be, and I don't know when I'm actually going to get to that, so rather than lose pieces of the radio, I just decided to go ahead and put it back together. Now I want to show you one last thing on this power supply. We're unloaded, and you see, according to the power supply, we're reading about 8 volts here. Actually, the digital meter says more like 9.5 volts. But whenever we draw about an amp and a half from this power supply, you'll see it drop down to 6 volts. So let's turn the radio on now and watch the meter fall down. Yep, there you go. You saw what happened there. And this thing actually sounds better inside of the cabinet, which is usually the case. The speaker mounted in its proper position inside of a wooden cabinet always makes for better tone.
Here.
Let's turn the lights off. See what kind of DX we might can get.
Meter striker.
There's something.
There's no way to explain it, and the evidence is nowhere to be found.
Better than he did a year ago, but last year's numbers were through the roof, offensive.
That's probably the country station at 1490. So this thing's doing pretty good. And I think once we replace that mechanical vibrator, that'll get rid of a lot of what you're hearing there. And probably what's about to happen is this vibrator is fixing to get pulled and put back in the zenith set before something gets misplaced. And then this will just sit on the shelf until I'm ready to work on it again.
BP automatically where it's down
To get the rest of what the outcome.
And now I know who I am because there's a
So why do you say people should see this? What do you get out of
Well, I
seeing
think
this documentary?
it's because with the red flag laws and psychiatry will be their next weapon.
Oh, okay, I'm catching up now. I see what you're saying.
Yes.
Where they could diagnose you with almost anything and then deny you your right to own a gun.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there's everything from jet lag disorders, all sorts of crazy stuff.
Oh my gosh!
And there's no, there's getter and
you
it
can't
talks about how
unprove it.
some of their how would you say
Something
their
to think about, folks.
diagnoses have changed because how they get some of their stuff, they vote on. There's no actual.
There's no real science.
Yeah, there's no actual science. They vote on some of this stuff.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you what.
Alright, here's the vibrator out of the Philco once again. We're going to whack it some more and see if we can persuade this thing to start on its own. I'm not holding out any hope, but like they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I've tried unsoldering this here to no avail, so I'm just going to have to cut this open when the time comes. just think this thing's just old and worn out, and there's just not a lot we can do for it. I have the original vibrator plugged back in, and I had to slide the chassis back out because the wrench I have that's short enough that would have fit in there is a little bit on the worn side and wouldn't grab the bolt heads. The one I have that's in good shape that will grab the bolt heads is too long, so I had to slide the chassis out. I really don't think this thing's going to fire up, but let's see. Nope. It's not doing anything. It's just buzzing, but that's it. No activity.